The rain had been falling on the great house at Wexbourne for the better part of an hour when the woman in the grey travelling cloak knocked at the front door, and the footman who opened it looked at her boots before he looked at her face. There was a carriage behind her in the gravel sweep, plain and unmarked, and a trunk being unloaded by a man who did not wear livery. The footman did not move aside. Above them, on the wide stone steps that led up to the entrance hall, a tall man stood framed in the lamplight of the open doorway, and he watched the exchange without coming down. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulder, his dark coat cut close, and his face still as ice over a river, and when the footman murmured something to him over his shoulder, the man said one sentence that carried down the steps and into the rain. He said the tradesman's entrance was at the side of the house, and that a woman of her sort would find the kitchen door more suited to her. She did not flinch at it. That was the first thing the household would later say to one another, in the hours and days that followed, when they tried to reconstruct exactly how it had begun. She did not flinch, and she did not argue. She stood in the rain with the water running off the brim of her plain bonnet, and she looked up at the man on the steps, and there was something in her stillness that did not match the grey cloak or the unmarked carriage or the boots that the footman had judged her by. To the household watching from the windows, she was nobody. A woman turned away at the door of a house that was not hers, in weather that was not kind, by a master who did not suffer interruption. She was a small grey figure in a large wet evening, and she was about to become the most important person any of them had ever met, though not one of them knew it yet, and neither for some hours more did she let on. Stay with this woman. You will want to have been here at the beginning. Her name was Eleanor Hartley, and she had once been welcome at doors a great deal grander than this one. She was 29 years old, which the season had long since decided was the age at which a woman without a husband ceased to be a possibility and became instead a fact to be managed. She had a straight back and steady hands, and a face that the firelight, had anyone bothered to bring her near a fire, would have shown to be quietly handsome rather than plain. Yet no one had bothered. Her father had been a man of property and of poor judgment in the men he trusted, and when he died, he had left her a name with weight in it, and very little else, or so the world believed. The world was wrong about a great many things concerning her, but the world did not yet know that, and she had learned, over the long years of being wrong about, to keep her own counsel and to wait. The man on the steps was Julian Croft, the new master of Wexbourne, and the household had learned in the 6 months of his tenancy to read his moods the way sailors read the sky. He had taken the house furnished and staffed, the previous family having let it go after a run of bad seasons, and he had come into the county with money that nobody could quite trace to its source, and a manner that discouraged the asking. He was cold. Everyone agreed on that. He was cold in the way that a man becomes cold when something has been burned out of him, and the ash has set hard, and he did not explain himself, and he did not apologize, and he had never once in 6 months been seen to smile. The county had decided he was proud. That was the word they used. A proud man, they said, in a fine house, who turned good families away from his door as readily as he turned away the rain. Eleanor went around to the side. In the end, not because she accepted the judgment, but because she was wet and the hour was late, and she had come a long way and she had not come to quarrel on a doorstep. The kitchen door opened to her knock, and a broad woman with flour to her elbows and a candle in her hand looked out, and her whole face changed when she saw who stood there. The candle trembled. The woman whispered a word that was not a name but a station, an old word, a word from another house and another life, and Eleanor put a finger briefly to her own lips, and the broad woman swallowed whatever she had been about to cry out and stepped back to let her in. They knew each other. That much the kitchen understood at once, the scullery maid and the boot boy and the undercook, all going still over their work, though what the knowing meant, none of them could say. The broad woman was Mrs. Mentz Finch, and she had been housekeeper at Wexbourne for 30 years, through 3 families and a great deal of weather, and she had held Eleanor as an infant in a house that no longer stood. She got the wet cloak off her and the bonnet, and sat her by the kitchen fire with a cup of something hot between her raw, cold hands. And she did not ask the questions that were burning in her because she could see that Eleanor was tired in a way that went deeper than the journey. So instead, she talked. She talked about the house and the new master, and the strangeness of the last half-year, and somewhere in the talking she said the thing that made Eleanor go still over her cup. She said the master had taken the house from the agent, and that the agent had taken it from a man in London, and that the man in London had bought the debt of the family that owned it, and that nobody in the whole chain had ever once spoken to the family itself, because the family had been told the house was lost. Eleanor set down her cup. She asked very quietly. "The name of the man in London," Mrs. Finch told her. And Eleanor sat for a long moment looking into the fire and the household. Had it been watching her then instead of the gray figure at the front door, might have seen the thing that the rain had hidden, which was that she was not a woman who had come to a strange house for shelter. She was a woman who had come home. In the morning, the master sent down word that the new companion to his ward had arrived and was to present herself in the library at 10 o'clock. Eleanor went. She wore the plainest of the gowns from her trunk, a soft gray thing that had seen better seasons, and she pinned her hair simply, and she went up the back stairs and along the gallery to the library, and she let herself be looked at by a man who did not remember turning her away in the rain the night before, because to him she had been nobody, and a man like Julian Croft did not keep an inventory of the nobodies. He refused. The library was the finest room in the house. It rose 2 stories, the shelves climbing to a painted ceiling, and the morning light came gray and clean through the tall windows and lay across a floor of dark, polished wood. He stood at the far end of it with his back to her, looking out at the wet grounds, and he did not turn when she came in. He told her, with his back still to her, that his ward was a difficult child, that 3 companions had already given notice, that he expected competence and discretion and very little conversation, and that her wages would be paid quarterly. Then he turned to dismiss her, and he saw her face for the first time in the light. Something moved in him. It was very slight, and it was gone almost before it arrived, but Eleanor was watching for it the way she had learned to watch for the weather. And she saw it, a stillness, where there had not quite been stillness before. The smallest catch, as though a man walking on familiar stairs had found one step a half-inch higher than he remembered. He covered it instantly. He asked her name. She gave it. "Hartley," she said. "Miss Hartley." And he repeated it once, the words level, his voice low, and he held her gaze a beat, longer than a master holds the gaze of a servant. And then he told her the child would be brought to her at noon, and he turned back to the window. And the audience that was only herself understood that the man had felt something he had no name for and had filed it away as nothing. The heroine did not understand it. She thought he had looked at her the way the footman had looked at her boots. The ward was a girl of 6 named Beatrice, and she was not difficult so much as she was furious in the contained and frightening way of a child who has decided that wanting things is dangerous. She had lost both parents inside a single year, the housekeeper said, and the master had taken her in because there was no one else, and he did not know what to do with her. And so he did the thing that frightened men do, which was to keep her at arm's length and call it discipline. Eleanor knew the look on the child's face. She had worn it herself, in the years after her father died, the look of a person who has learned that the safest thing to love is nothing at all. She did not try to coax the girl. She simply stayed, hour after hour, present and unhurried, and she let the child decide for herself how near she wished to come. It was in the 2nd week that the master saw the thing. He was not meant to see. He had come up to the nursery floor for some reason that he gave to himself as inspection, though the truth of it was that the new companion had not given notice, which after 3 predecessors was itself a small disturbance in his ordered world, and he found himself curious about the woman who had not yet fled. The nursery door stood ajar. He did not go in. He stood in the gallery, in the shadow between 2 windows, and he watched. Eleanor was on the floor. Her gray gown was spread around her on the boards, and the child, Beatrice, was beside her, not touching, but close. Closer than the girl had let anyone come in months, and Eleanor was reading aloud. She read in a low, even voice, a story about a girl and a river and a house, at the end of a long road. And when she came to a hard place in the story, a place where the child in the tale was afraid, Eleanor did not soften it or hurry past it. She let it be hard. She read it true. And the real child beside her, the furious, careful child who loved nothing because loving was dangerous, put out one small hand and laid it on the gray wool of Eleanor's sleeve, lightly, the way one tests whether a stove is hot. Eleanor did not stop reading. She did not look down or make of it a triumph. She only shifted, very slightly, so that the child's hand had a better place to rest, and went on with the story. In the gallery, the proud master of Wexbourne stood very still. He did not go in. He watched a woman he had hired for wages teach his ward, without a single word of instruction, that it was safe to put out a hand, and he found that he could not immediately move, and that there was a pressure behind his ribs that he had not felt in a long time and did not welcome. Then he turned and went back down the stairs, and that evening at dinner he was colder than he had been in weeks, and only Mrs. Finch, setting down the dishes, understood that the cold was the sound of a door he had nailed shut beginning very faintly to give. The dowager came on a Thursday. She was the master's aunt by marriage, Lady Marchmont, a woman of 70 with a straight spine and a cold, clear eye, and she had appointed herself the guardian of the family's consequence, in a world she felt was forgetting how consequence was supposed to work. She arrived with a maid and a mountain of luggage and an opinion about everything, and within an hour of her arrival she had reviewed the household and found the new companion wanting. Eleanor was summoned to the drawing-room to be looked at. She came. "Waj?" The dowager examined her through a glass on a stick, slowly from her plain shoes to her simply pinned hair, and then she turned to her nephew and delivered her verdict as though the woman in question were a piece of furniture of doubtful provenance. "A drab," the dowager said. "You have hired a drab to raise the child, Julian. Where in heaven did you find her?" "At a back door." The word landed in the quiet drawing-room, and the two maids by the wall went still, and the master said nothing at all, and Eleanor, who had been called a great many things in the long years of being wrong about, felt the old familiar heat climb her throat, and kept her face perfectly smooth. A drab. She held the word and turned it over and set it down. She had been a woman turned away at a door, and now she was a drab in a drawing-room, and she thought, with a calm that surprised even her, that the house seemed determined to tell her again and again exactly how little it saw her. She said none of this. She curtsied to the precise depth that a companion owed, a dowager no deeper, and she asked whether there would be anything further, and the dowager waved her away, as one waves away a smell. That night, Eleanor wrote a letter. She wrote it by a single candle in the small cold room they had given her under the eaves, and she wrote it in a hand that was firmer than a companion's hand, had any business being. And she addressed it to a firm of solicitors in London, whose name would have meant nothing to anyone at Wexbourne, and a great deal to the man in the city who had bought a family's debt and sold the family's house. She sealed it with a plain seal. Then she sat for a while with the cold letter in her lap, looked at the candle, and she thought about her father, and about a promise she had made over a grave, and about how long a thing can take when a woman has no rank to hurry it. If you have ever waited for a slow justice, you will know the particular quality of that candlelight. She blew it out and slept. The proximity built the way weather builds. It built in the corridors where they passed, and he stood aside for her now, in a way he did not stand aside for the other servants. A half-second of stillness as she went by, that he could not have explained and did not try to. It built at the nursery door, where he began to appear in the evenings, ostensibly to bid the child good night, and where he would stand a moment too long in the lamplight watching the woman read. It built one afternoon in the cold of the East Passage, where Eleanor had stopped to steady a stack of linen, and he came upon her suddenly, and they were closer than either had intended, near enough that she felt the warmth come off him in the cold air, and her own pulse answer it before her mind gave it leave. And she stepped back, and he stepped back, and neither of them said anything, and she went on down the passage with her face burning and her hands not quite steady on the linen, furious at her own body for the lie it had told. He took to giving her commands. "Eat something," he said one evening when she had stayed too late with a fevered Beatrice and gone gray with tiredness, and there was a tray sent up to her room that had not been there before. "Sit down," he said on a morning when she had risen too fast from the schoolroom floor and swayed. "Stop," he said once sharply, when she had reached for a heavy trunk that a footman ought to have carried, and he took it from her hands himself before he knew he had done it, and set it down and looked at his own hands as though they had acted without him. The heroine heard the commands as coldness. A master, ordering a servant. She did not hear the thing underneath them, the thing the whole house could see if it cared to look, which was a man who did not know how to say "be careful with yourself," and so said, "Sit down," instead. The hidden thing in him came out on a night in the library, and it came out almost by accident. Beatrice had had a bad dream, and Eleanor had carried her down to the one room in the house that the child seemed to find safe, and they had fallen asleep, the two of them, in the great chair by the dying fire. And when Eleanor woke, it was past midnight, and the master was sitting across from her in the dark, with a glass untouched at his elbow, and a small object, turning over and over in his fingers. It was a miniature, a portrait the size of a coin, in a worn gold case, and he was not aware that she was awake, and he spoke to it, very low, the way a man speaks when he believes himself alone. He said a name. It was a woman's name, and it was not Eleanor's. And the way he said it told the whole story before he said another word. He had had a wife. The household had never spoken of her, because the master had never permitted her to be spoken of. And Eleanor understood now the shape of the coldness, that it was not pride at all, but the long, hard scar tissue grown over a wound he had decided he had caused. His wife had died, and somewhere in the manner of it he had found a way to lay the blame at his own door, and he had nailed himself shut over it, and called the nails discipline, the same discipline he tried to teach a grieving child, the same arm's length, the same cold. He looked up then and found her awake and watching, and for one unguarded moment his face was open, and then the door in it closed, and he put the miniature away inside his coat against his heart, where the audience now understood it had been all along, the thing his hand had been reaching toward every time it brushed his breast pocket in the weeks before. He stood and said it was late, and that she should put the child to bed, his voice gone level and cold again. But Eleanor had seen the open face and could not unsee it, and she rose with the sleeping girl in her arms and paused at the door, and said the one true thing she could not have said. She said that a man could love someone with his whole heart and still not have been the one who failed her. She did not wait to see what it did to him. She carried the child upstairs. Behind her, in the dark library, the proud master of Wexbourne sat for a long time with his hand pressed flat against the miniature over his heart, and did not move. After that the house seemed to tilt very slightly, the way a great ship tilts, when the cargo shifts in the hold, and only those standing in exactly the right place can feel it. The dowager felt it. She had not survived 70 years in the world without learning to feel a tilt, and she did not like the direction of this one, and she began to make arrangements. She had a candidate. The candidate was a young woman of excellent family, and £20,000 named Lady Sophia Vane, ice-fair and well-drilled, who arrived for an extended visit with her mother, and a great deal of luggage, and who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and had every reason to believe it. The dowager seated Lady Sophia at the master's right hand at dinner, and contrived 100 small occasions, and watched her nephew with the patience of a general, and Eleanor watched it. All from the place a companion stands, which is to say from the edge of the room, holding the child's hand. It was Lady Sophia who voiced the label the second time, though she did it more prettily than the dowager had. She said it in the long gallery, where Eleanor had brought Beatrice to see the portraits, not knowing the visiting ladies were there. She said to her mother, in the carrying voice of a person who wishes to be overheard, that it was a charming thing to keep a drab about the nursery, so cheap and so devoted, like a good plain dog, and that, of course, one would replace such a creature the moment one had a household of one's own to order properly. The child Beatrice went rigid. She had heard. Eleanor felt the small hand tighten in hers, and she looked down at the furious, frightened face, and she made the only choice she could think to make, which was to crouch down to the child's level. There in the gallery in front of the visiting ladies, and to say clearly and without heat that some people decide what a person is worth by what they are wearing, and that those people are always, in the end, surprised. Then she rose and curtsied and led the child away, and did not give Lady Sophia the satisfaction of a backward glance. The master had heard that too. He had come into the gallery by the far door, in time to hear the visitor's pretty cruelty and the companion's quiet answer, and that night the temperature of the house dropped several degrees, and Lady Sophia, who was not a stupid woman, began to understand that something in the great cold house was not going according to the plan her elders had made. Though she could not yet have said what, the dowager understood it better, and she moved faster. Within a week, she had done 3 things. She had written to the master's man of business, suggesting that the companion's references be examined more closely, hinting at irregularities. She had let it be known, in the soft poisonous way of a great lady, that the companion had arrived at the house in a most irregular fashion, at a back door, in the dark, like a person with something to hide, and she had set a date, in concert with Lady Sophia's mother, for a small evening party at Wexbourne, an intimate gathering of the better county families, at which she had every intention. The master's engagement to Lady Sophia Vane would be quietly understood to have been settled. She arranged it all with the confidence of a woman whose script had worked in every drawing-room in England for 50 years. She had no way of knowing that the script was about to meet, for the first time in her long life, a room that would not perform it. The letter Eleanor had been waiting for arrived 2 days before the party. Mrs. Wan Finch brought it up to the cold room under the eaves herself, having intercepted it before the dowager's maid could see the London seal, and she stood while Eleanor broke it open and read it once, and then again, and Mrs. Sash Finch watched the woman she had held as an infant go very still and very straight, and set the letter down, and look at the candle for a long moment, the way she had looked at the kitchen fire on the first night. Then Eleanor told her, quietly, what the letter said. And Mrs. Finch, who had served 3 families in this house through 30 years of weather, sat down rather suddenly, in the small hard chair, and pressed her flower-roughened hand to her mouth, because she understood at last whose house she had been keeping all these years, and to whom, by every law of the land, it had quietly returned. The party was a small triumph of the dowager's art. The drawing-room and the long gallery beyond it were lit with what felt like 1,000 candles. The better county families arranged in their silks, Lady Sophia in ice blue at the master's side, the dowager presiding from a chair near the fire with her glass on its stick and her diamonds catching the light. Eleanor had not been invited. Of course, a companion does not attend the master's parties. Yet the child Beatrice had been promised that she might come down for half an hour to be admired, as children of the house were, and Eleanor was to bring her down and stand at the edge and take her up again. And so Eleanor came into the bright crowded room in her plain gray gown with the child's hand in hers, and the dowager saw her and chose that moment, before the assembled families, to make an end of her once and for all. She said it the 3rd time, then, and she said it to wound. She said loudly enough for the room to hear and fall silent, that she would thank the companion to remember her place and remove the child, that this was a gathering of persons of quality and not a kitchen, and that she had warned her nephew against engaging a creature who had come crawling to the back door in the dark with no references a respectable house would credit and no family any of them had ever heard of. A drab off the road, the dowager said, into the ringing silence who had presumed too far. The room held its breath. Lady Sophia smiled into her glass. The child's hand shook in Eleanor's, and Eleanor stood in the center of the bright, cruel room with every great face in the county turned toward her in judgment, exactly as the house had judged her at its door on the first wet night. And she understood that the moment had come and that she had a choice about how to meet it. She chose to meet it with the truth plainly and without raising her voice. She said that she would remove the child gladly, for the hour was late. And then she said that since the matter of her family had been raised before so many witnesses, she would answer it once, so that it need never be raised again. She said her name was Eleanor Hartley. She said that her father had been Sir Edmund Hartley of this county, and that this house, Wexbourne, in which they all stood, had been the Hartley house for 4 generations, and that it had been taken from her father at the end of his life by men who told the dying man his home was lost, and bought his debt for pennies, and sold the house through agents to a tenant, all without one of them ever troubling to speak to the daughter the law had left it to. She said the debt had been bought in bad faith and the conveyance was unsound, and that she had spent 4 years and the last of her money proving it in the quiet, patient way available to a woman with no rank to hurry anything along. And she said that 2 days ago, the court in London had confirmed what she had known when she knocked at her own front door in the rain and was sent around to the kitchen like a tradesman. The freehold of Wexbourne was hers. It had never lawfully ceased to be. The silence in the room changed its quality entirely. The dowager's glass came down from her eye. For a moment the old face simply did not understand, the script running on in her head against a reality that had stopped performing it, and then understanding arrived, and with it something the room had never seen on that proud face, which was the dawning recognition that she had been standing in another woman's drawing room insulting another woman's hospitality, and that every great family she had assembled to witness her nephew's advancement had instead witnessed this. She began a sentence, and did not finish it. Lady Sophia had gone the color of her own gown, and the master of Wexbourne, who was not the master of Wexbourne and now knew that he never had been, stood very still at the head of his borrowed room and looked at the woman in the plain grey gown as though seeing her, fully and finally, for the first time, the woman he had turned from his door, the woman he had hired for wages, the woman who had taught his ward to put out a hand, the woman who had told him in the dark that a man might love with his whole heart and still not be the one who failed. He crossed the room. He did not hurry, and he did not speak until he reached her, the whole bright company parting before him. And he stopped in front of her, close enough that only she and the child and the nearest few could have heard the first thing he said, which was that he had refused her at her own door, and that he would be sorry for it every day that he lived. And then he turned, so that the room could hear, and he took her hand, the bare, cold hand of a woman everyone present had been taught that morning to despise, and he said the thing that ended it. "This is her house," he said, "and I am asking to stay in it." He did not say it loudly. He said it level, his voice low. In the silence the truth had built, and it was 12 words, and no more, and it could not be unsaid. The dowager sat down in her chair as though her strings had been cut. Lady Sophia's mother took her daughter by the elbow and began, with the instinct of 50 years of drawing rooms, the long, graceful business of leaving. And around the edges of the room, the county families who an hour before had been ready to despise a companion at a great man's word, began to remember, one by one, aloud, that they had known Sir Edmund, that they had dined in this very room when his wife was alive, that the daughter had her father's eyes. The crowd's verdict reversed itself in the space of a few minutes, as crowd's verdicts do. And Eleanor stood in the center of it holding the master's hand and the child's hand and did not gloat, because she had learned long ago that being right is a quieter thing than the world expects, and because the only 2 faces in the room that mattered to her were the one looking up at her in wonder from the height of a 6-year-old, and the one looking at her as though she were the first warm thing he had seen in years. She did not give him an answer that night. She had owned the house for 2 days, and been refused at its door, and called a drab 3 times, and she found she was in no great hurry to settle the rest of her life in front of the whole county. She took the child up to bed. On the stairs, with Beatrice heavy and half asleep against her shoulder, she paused and looked back down at the man standing alone at the foot of them, the bright party dissolving around him, and she let him see her face, and that was answer enough to keep him standing there a long time after she had gone up. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small grey church at the edge of the estate where 4 generations of Hartleys lay under the stones, with Mrs. Finch in the front pew, weeping into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth, and the child Beatrice, scattering the petals she had been entrusted with all at once, in a single joyful heap, the moment she came through the door, because some lessons about safety, once learned, are learned all the way. The dowager was not present. She had retired to a smaller house of her own, corrected rather than destroyed. And in time she would come to dinner, and in more time she would come to be fond, in her dry, cold way, of the great niece the marriage gave her. But that was later, and the spring belonged to the church, and the petals and the stones. It was winter again before the house felt entirely like a home, the first winter that was wholly theirs. And on a still evening near Christmas, the snow came down soft and steady past the tall library windows, the finest room in the house. The room where a proud, cold man had once stood with his back turned and told a woman he expected very little conversation. The fire was high. Beatrice was asleep on the hearthrug, with a book open on her chest and the firelight on her face, and she slept the loose, untroubled sleep of a child who has finally decided that wanting things is safe. Eleanor sat in the great chair with her husband's head against her shoulder, and on the small table at her elbow lay the worn gold miniature. Open now, no longer hidden in a coat against a closed heart. Set out in the warm light where the woman in it could watch over the room she had once loved. He had taken it out at last. He had stopped. Nailing the door shut, Eleanor looked at the snow falling on the windows of the house that had been her father's and was now hers, on the gardens going white in the dark, on the small gray church where the stones were gathering their soft covering, and she thought of the wet night she had stood at the front door in the rain and been sent around to the kitchen like a tradesman, and how the man who sent her had not known, could not have known, that he was refusing the only person who could ever truly let him in. The door he had shut against her had been her own. The door she had finally opened had been his. Outside, the snow went on falling, and the candle on the table burned steady, and the house at Wexbourne, after all its long bad weather, was at last exactly full enough. Thank you for staying until the very end. If Eleanor's long, patient walk back to her own front door moved you, leave a word below to say so, and stay close for the next of these quiet stories.